So if everyone just give me a moment, I'm getting our video set up to be live streamed on YouTube, which we are good for.
I'll just say that I love to see people's faces when I'm talking to them. So if you're not feeling shy, feel free to leave your camera on. That's that's my preference. I love to see who I'm talking to. So unless there's any reason they shouldn't.
No, I mean, what I will say, and I'll say this to everyone, well, this is the best time of any. We are going to be recording the webinar here in just a moment. We are also live on YouTube. If for any reason you don't want your face shown on either one of those sides, on either the recording or the YouTube live, then I would ask you to turn your cameras off at this time. But that being said, we'd love to see your face. And I totally agree with Kristen that I'm not planning to do all that much talking tonight, but I also love seeing people's faces. We will, as with all Love Boldly webinars, once the conversation that Kristen and I are going to have wraps up, we will go into an approximately 30 minutes of off-the-record questioning, or that sounded so formal, of questions. Sorry. At that point, we will, in the recording, we will also end the YouTube live. So I am going to invite anyone who's on the YouTube live, if you're hanging out over there, I will put the link to our Zoom room in the chat there. Feel free to join us for that question and answer. But again, that will be off the record, just for everyone's safety and comfortability to ask questions that you might have. So give me just one moment to drop the link for anyone who might be joining us on YouTube, and then we'll get started. Okay. Kristen, are you good to go?
I'm good. I'm ready when you are. Done.
Then I am going to start recording. So thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. For those of you who I've only just met or who may not have met me yet, my name is Ben Hilskamp. I am the Executive Director here at Love Boldly. It gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight Kristen Komarnicki. Did I get anywhere close? Okay, good. Kristen is a longtime friend and partner of Love Boldly, and someone who I really feel like our organization has learned a lot from, and whose example we try to follow. So I would, without further ado, I would ask Kristen if she would introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background.
Okay. So yes, my name is Kristen Komarnicki, and I am the Director of Dialogue and Convening for a nonprofit called Christians for Social Action, for which I direct the program called Oriented to Love, which is a program that is grounded in the principles of loving dialogue across deep difference. And we specialize in helping people have better conversations across deep difference in theological conviction, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So yeah, I do weekend dialogues that I prepare people for. We do live fishbowl dialogue demonstrations. We do workshops to help people have better tools for leaning into conflict, because conflict is not only inevitable, but it can bring a lot of gifts. So if we stop avoiding it and lean into it in a compassionately curious way, we can actually receive a lot of those gifts. So yeah, so that's what I do. And you asked me about my background, Ben. Was there, like, what in particular did you want to know?
Anything you'd like to share with us? Anything that would be relevant to our conversation?
Oh, okay. Well, it's kind of one of those things where I feel like God just sort of just threw this in my lap, this kind of work. I didn't go looking for it. And I was a few years into it and I thought, how did I get here? What is, I never, I don't really understand. I wasn't looking for it. And then you look back over your life and you can sort of see the connective tissue in your life. I just find that really interesting to see how God leads us from one thing to another. And I just realized that I've always been attracted to difference. I I loved moving when I was a kid to different states. My siblings hated that. I didn't actually realize that until I was an adult. I was like, wasn't that great? And they were like, we hated that. So obviously I liked new adventures, new people, new places, new discoveries. I traveled in Europe and met a Frenchman who I ended up marrying. So I'm in a transnational marriage, which is, lots of things to negotiate there. We lived in Hong Kong for 8 years. So I've lived on 3 different continents and spoken different languages, and just really appreciate the things I learn and the gifts I receive by getting to know people and opening my heart to people who seem different from me on the surface anyway, and sometimes in really significant ways that matter. But yeah, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. So I guess dialogue is my way of bringing differences into the same room and saying, let's learn from each other. What are the gifts that are to be had here?
Thank you, Kristen. So you mentioned oriented to love, which some of us, I think, are very much aware of what OTL is. For anyone who might not be so aware of OTL, could you talk a little bit about what OTL does?
Yes. So the mainstay of our work is we curate small groups of 12 people for maximum diversity. So the one thing that everybody has in common is that they say they are following Jesus. So we have that very, very fundamental thing in common. And then it's an application process, which allows me to get the information that I need about folks in order to build a group for maximum diversity. So I'm looking for diversity in sexual orientation, gender identity, and theological conviction. So each of our groups has 12 people. 6 will identify as queer, or LGBTQ, same-sex attracted, whatever language they use. Transgender, non-binary, and then 6 of the folks will identify as straight cisgender. And in each of those groups, some of the people will identify more as traditional leaning, and some will identify as more progressive leaning. So if you use side A, side B language, there'll be some of that in each group. So we're really looking for a wide diversity of experience, because people are going to be sharing out of their own stories, their own life experience. And even when we talk about theology, it's sort of out of a lived theology, what this theology means to me and how I live it out, how it's affected me. We're not sort of like, it's not about hermeneutics. It's sort of like, what does this lived theology look like? So that's the mainstay of our work. We do about 4 or 5 dialogue groups a week. There's a weekend. It's completely confidential, a completely immersive experience. And each of those groups is prepared over an 8 to 10 week period, so that we're not just showing up. People aren't just sort of coming off the street and saying, let's dialogue, right? We have prepared our hearts carefully over time to meet our theological other, our sexual or gender other.
And I can definitely say, from what I've heard, from what I know about OTL, is that OTL has been very successful over the years. So what is it that you think makes OTL so successful?
I really think it's a combination of, think that the preparation is the secret sauce. I think a lot of people think we should just be able to dialogue, right? Or that's just something you can just do. And I've come to understand that true dialogue takes a lot of intention. And of course you need 2 or more people to agree to dialogue, right? You don't just walk up to someone and say, we're going to dialogue now, right? You have to get an agreement. And that involves agreeing to maybe some, I used to use ground rules. I'm trying to use agreements now. It sounds so much nicer. People agree to behave in certain ways, to show respect in certain ways to each other, to listen. And I think one of the main things is that I ask that everybody come towards the dialogue in a posture of learner. Now, I think a lot of us who grew up in the evangelical church are taught to be teachers. We're taught to be preachers. Go and take the word to the end, the truth to the ends of the earth. We're very much sort of commissioned to tell others, to speak the truth in love. But many of us are not taught how to listen in love. And it occurred to me a while back that if everybody comes as a teacher, there's not a whole lot of learning that's going to be going on. There's going to be competitive teaching, right? But if all of us come in posture of learner, we are automatically, necessarily going to learn from each other just by being in each other's presence. So you, Ben, just by you being Ben, if I come with the attitude of, I have something to learn from you, Ben, and I'm going to watch you and listen to you, I am definitely going to learn something. Whereas the opposite doesn't end up with a lot of learning. Ends up with a lot of frustration. So inviting people to come in a posture of learner with mutual vulnerability and bravery has just yielded beautiful fruit. And I think it's the heart of Christ. Christ was a good listener. Christ was always asking questions. In fact, there's a great book out that I just discovered this year called Jesus is the Question to All Your Answers. The title of the book is Jesus is the Question, but it came from a quote that this gentleman heard someone say, that Jesus is the question to all your answers. And I think that is such a beautiful encapsulation of how we think we need to get the answers right, but actually it's really about the questions. And Jesus asked people questions all the time. I think there's something like 307 questions of his that are recorded in the gospel. And he wasn't looking for information. Jesus didn't need our information. He asked questions that were invitations to look deeper, to reflect. Who do you say that I am? What do you want me to do for you? Where are you going? I mean, just beautiful questions that people could answer in a simple way, but there was always something deeper that Christ was after, and that prompted deeper reflection. So I think so. Questions form the core of our work, our dialogue work, and I just think that that's part of the coaching and helping people ask better questions and listen with more posture of learner is a big part of why it works so well.
Kristen, you said something earlier that struck me, and I wrote it down, and I wanted to come back to it, but I think you've gotten there as well. You said that you, and I'm sorry if I'm misstating how you said this, but you said something to the effect of wanting to encourage people to be compassionately curious. And I wonder, and as you talk about encouraging folks to be listeners and learners rather than speakers, I wonder if you can talk about how you and the folks you work with have really encouraged that compassionate curiosity.
Yes, good question, Ben. Compassionate curiosity for me is true curiosity for the sake of understanding. So if I pretend to be curious about you, or if I ask questions about things I don't really care about, like, where did you get your shirt? I mean, I love that color, but I don't really care where you got it. So, a lot of people sort of make conversation to be nice or to be polite or whatever, but they're not really accessing what they're really curious about. And I think curiosity actually needs to be developed. Some people are just not curious, right? But so curiosity requires me to take some time to sit with you, to watch you, to hear you, and to wonder about you. To wonder, who is Ben? How did Ben get to this position he's in today? Ben has a story. And even if I don't agree with your ideas, or even if I don't respect your ideas or where you've landed, I can still respect you. I can still respect that you're a fellow child of God, and that the things you believe, even if I disagree with them, I want to start from the position of assuming that you believe those things for a reason, right? You didn't come out of the womb. None of us came out of the womb with political views or theological views. They were developed over time. Some of them were tested more rigorously than others. Some of them have not been tested. Some of them we've just sort of coasted on the assumptions or the things that our parents handed us. But everybody holds their beliefs for a reason. And sometimes when they're challenged, they change a little bit. Sometimes they don't. But the point is that there's a story in there. And if I really want to understand your beliefs, I really need to understand you. And you are actually much more interesting to me than your beliefs are. So compassion, a compassionate curiosity takes the time to figure out, to try and understand who the other person is. And I think a lot of times we ask questions that, a lot of our questions aren't questions at all. They're attacks. You know, if I say to you, how could you possibly believe that? Well, that's a question, right? There's a question mark on the end. But clearly the main thing I'm conveying is that I don't like what you believe. And I'm in shock that you could believe such a thing, right? But if I say to you, help me understand how you came to this conclusion, I'm really interested. That's not technically a question. There's no question mark. It's a request, right? But that's a beautiful question that expresses compassionate curiosity. A lot of us are taught to sort of front load our opinions in our questions, like, oh, I think that X, Y, and Z, don't you? And then we just ask for agreement or disagreement. I'm sure we've all been in a public event where the microphone gets passed around and someone says, I have a question, and then they have a 20-minute comment. A lot of people use questions as Trojan horses to smuggle their opinion in, and then they sort of shape it up at the end to make it look like a question. So I don't say that to accuse. I just really don't think that many of us are taught true curiosity that sort of sets our own self aside in order to better see and understand the other. There's so much interference. We're so soaked in our own selves that it can be very hard to get outside of ourselves to express real curiosity.
Yeah, I'm struck by that. I think about, and someone's going to have to help me with the verse, but there's a great part where Jesus says something to the effect of, don't mind the dust in someone else's eye when you have a log in yours. And I think I think there's definitely sort of a universal human, I don't know, tendency to get too much in front of ourselves. So how do we teach that curiosity? How do we cultivate it?
How do we cultivate it? Well, don't watch the news, because your basic news interviewer is appalling. I'm always just appalled at some of the questions that are asked that are either non-questions, are obvious questions, or leading questions, accusatory questions, or just so closed and uninteresting. So don't watch the news. I really recommend reading that book, Jesus is the Question, because it really sort of could spark your imagination on looking at the kinds of questions. In fact, in the back of the book, they've listed 150 questions that Jesus asked. He asked twice that. But and the author recommends that you just read through those out loud. It's just like the weight of the questions, the richness of them is really beautiful. So surround yourself with other people who are curious. Be on the lookout for good questions, and also for how questions land in general. What kind of questions make you feel interesting to the people around you? When someone asks you a good question, you can always tell, because you're like, you kind of cock your head a minute, because it's requiring some thought, right? It's not just a one-word answer, a yes or a no, or a factual tidbit. They're asking you to reflect on some part of yourself. And listen to what happens when people come home for vacation. How was your vacation? It was good. Well, how did you get there? How was your flight? How long did that flight last? We often ask a lot of these sort of logistical questions, but when someone says to you, what was a highlight of your trip? what was it like to see your family after so long, after not seeing them during the pandemic? Those kinds of questions really stimulate imagination and reflection. So how do you build that? I think you start by recognizing that you need help, looking for examples, sort of sensitizing your ear to what's around you, and then asking yourself, how did I feel about that question? What did that question lead to? And just noticing the kinds of questions people ask you. And sometimes ask yourself, what do I really want to know? Like there's Dave Kuda on the screen. I'm looking at him. There are so many things I want to know about him. Do I really want to know, like I said before, like where he got his shirt, or, how old is that clock? Maybe, but there's probably other things. So just taking the time to really reflect about who people are and what you want to know about them.
Thank you. I want to maybe pivot a little bit and talk about, we have a few folks on the call who have heard me or folks from Love Boldly talk about how to start some of these types of conversations in our congregations, in our communities. And they've more than a few have heard me kind of ad nauseum probably talk about this. I wonder what you would share. How do we start these in our communities?
How do we start these? You mean conversations around difference?
Yeah, or around whether that be LGBTQ, whether that be some other form of difference, somewhere where we know there's likely to be conflict.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't recommend just going into and starting these conversations without first dealing with your own internal reactions to, socialization around conflict in general. So I do a workshop called Transforming Conflict Through Curiosity, where I go over a lot of these things, which is basically helping people understand their own feelings around conflict. So some of us, I'll say most of us aren't crazy about conflict. Some people love it. They love a rousing debate. But from my experience, most people are not fond of conflict, and sometimes are completely taken out by it. Like even a day or two can be lost if there's a real conflict in their life, or they even observe it, right? So doing your own work, understanding what your relationship to conflict is an absolute bottom line necessity before you go out and try to have deeper conversations. And I would say practice with the people who are closest to you. What triggers you? What are you feeling? What's going on in your body when you encounter conflict and difference? If you're feeling really threatened, if the fact that Joe holds an opposite view of you about a political situation or something like that, if you are completely frozen by that, you need to deal with that before you can enter into any conversation. So just being aware of what's going on for yourself is the very first thing to do. The second thing is that I always encourage people to do is when they're ready to have a conflictual or a difficult conversation, is to look for something they can affirm. So a lot of times we just see the mess. We see everything that looks scary. And it's really good to start out with something positive, even if it's like, wow, you're really passionate about that. You really care, or you've really done your homework. Now, I might disagree with everything you've just said, but are you really putting in the time? Look for something, some kernel of something that you can affirm, and state it to that person, because that can really catch people off guard. I love to tell the story that my sister works, she's an in-home therapist, or was for a long time, with families that were in trouble, in crisis. And she walked into a house, and the mother and father were an inch apart, nose to nose, screaming at the top of their lungs at each other. And she said, wow, you really care. And they sort of, it really completely threw them off kilter, right? And they said, what? And she said, yeah, if you didn't care, you'd be at opposite ends of the house, on different screens. You wouldn't hear, but you really care. And so that created the foundation for starting a conversation. So realizing what we're bringing to the table, looking for something to affirm, and then taking the time ahead of time. I highly recommend doing this ahead of time and not in the moment. Thinking of some good ways to launch the conversation. open-ended, curious questions that don't trigger the person, that don't have a hidden agenda or a hidden attack in there. So like the kinds of things I was saying earlier. So it might look like something like, wow, I see that you're really concerned about some of these issues, XYZ issue, right? Whatever it is. I'd be so interested in understanding how you came to your position on these issues. And I'd really be interested if you have a personal investment in this issue. And if you do, I'd love to hear the story. Like, what's your story about this? Whether it's abortion or sexuality or taxes or immigration, because you can't really disagree with someone's story. You can disagree with their conclusions, you can disagree with their theories or beliefs, but you can't disagree with their story. So when people go off, you'll notice that when people have the most vitriol and the most heat around something, they're often talking out of their heads, right? They're arguing facts and numbers and this guy and that guy. But if you get them to root it in their story, the whole temperature can come down. And then you find out that, well, this guy lost his job. His father lost his job to an immigrant who was working, without papers and was accepting less money, right? Or this person lost an uncle on the border because he was trying to desperately to get away to a better life and was killed by the border guard. So you find out what people's stories are, and it opens up a whole new world.
So much of what you just said is resonating with me that I'm having trouble drawing a good next coherent thought. But I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but we frame even this conversation tonight is framed as dialoguing across difference.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm hearing you say is, and you've used the words directly a few times already, is really being invited into learning. I'm hearing much more invitation and learning and telling stories, or telling our stories, rather than the sense of sort of, we know there's a difference, we know there's a conflict, and now we're going to meet that head on, which sounds very confrontational, bellicose even. Am I missing the point, or am I?
Are you asking about, is your question about the definition of dialogue that I'm using, or?
No, just how you're approaching dialogue and how you're approaching difficult conversations.
Right. Well, I guess, without connection, there is no dialogue. There is no communication, right? So if we go for connection, we will get somewhere. If we go to win, to make a point, to knock somebody off their pedestal, knock them onto their back foot, then we're not going to get connection, and we're not going to learn, and we're not going to have a relationship probably with that person. So I think I guess it depends on your goal. For me, the goal of dialogue is to understand. Do I want to be understood? Sure, I do want to be understood. Do I want to be seen and heard and appreciated? Absolutely. But if I can't offer those things to you, why would I ever expect to receive them? So the person who initiates the dialogue really does have to, you have to kind of go with a full cup towards dialogue. You can't, if you're traumatized or injured or bleeding or alone, that's probably not the best time to approach a difficult conversation. And I always say that we need each other to do this work. And honestly, even for little things, sometimes I have a conflict with one of my adult children, and I know I need to send a text or write something or make a phone call. I might workshop that thing 3 or 4 times with my husband and my best friend. Like, if it's really important, because it's so hard to see our own stuff. So like my first draft might be, my friend might be like, well, Kristen, there's a stinging judgment right in the middle of that. Like, as you thought, that wasn't in it. You thought if you buried it in the middle, no one would notice. And so I'm like, okay, I take a deep breath and I say, what would this look like if I remove judgment? What am I really curious about? Or what is it that I'm really trying to convey about how I feel or what I need? So, sometimes it really does take 3 or 4 times. And it's okay, because if it's taking hard work, that's a reflection of how important the relationship is to us. If it's just the mail delivery person or a clerk in a store, like, I don't have a relationship with them. I mean, hopefully I'm going to be kind, but I'm not going to check my words 3 times. I'm going to say, I didn't get good customer service or whatever. But the people that I have really important relationships with are the ones that I'm going to want to put in the work with. And we make mistakes, right? One tool that I use a lot is to ask for a redo. So if I say something to you, Ben, I'm terrible at thinking of off the cuff examples. I'm terrible at it. But if I say something to you and as soon as it's out of my mouth, or maybe even the next day, I think, I really didn't like the way I asked that. I was not acting out of my best self. You can just ask for a redo. And I have done this sometimes weeks, sometimes years later. I remember a conversation that was not fruitful, that was hurtful, either both ways, or I was hurtful to them. And I say, I really am trying to learn to do this a different way. Can we have a redo? I want to see how it can go differently. And apparently, I've read about this, about how we learn, how our brains learn. And redoing something in a better way, you have a much deeper learning than if you say, oh, Ben, I really wish I'd said this. I'm sorry. If you actually do a redo and say, Ben, this is how I want to do it this time, and you actually walk through it and it ends up with a different result, it's like we have a muscle memory of it, and we're more likely to do it well the next time than if we had just said, I'm sorry. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I want to take communication really seriously. I want to work at it. And it is a work in process. And we make tons of mistakes. And we can invite our loved ones and even our colleagues and neighbors into that process by just being vulnerable enough to say, oh, I've been working on this and I really blew it right there. Let me try again. Isn't that better? How did that land on you this time? And just turning everything into a laboratory, and inviting people in to be curious with you about how that works and why it worked better the next time.
Totally. I want to invite folks, before we go to kind of our off the record part of this conversation, is there anyone that has their own questions? A few people have dropped things in the chat. I don't want to be the only one yapping away. Okay. I thought I'd try. Well, Kristen, I've kind of hit the end of my questions. What else would you like to add? Oh, Terry, did you have something? Go for it.
Hey, Ben, thanks. Kristen, thanks so much. I'm taking notes here. I have a question about, you mentioned your 8-week preparation for your meetings. And I was wondering what might be involved in that 8 weeks with an eye toward avoiding, the people who are centered sort of gaining more from it and the people who are marginalized sort of giving more during it, if that makes sense. Like, in racial conversations, there's this idea, I'm kind of sharing my story where it's rooted with me, this idea that Black folks shouldn't have to keep explaining and teaching white folks, they need to be making the effort to learn for themselves and so on. Does that make enough sense already?
Yeah, well, I hear a couple of things. And I shouldn't say it's not 8 weeks. There's one weekly assignment for 8 weeks. That sort of sets people up. It's not 8 weeks of full-time work or anything. So just to talk about the preparation, Those are exercises in practicing vulnerability, in sharing parts of ourselves, in sifting through some of our beliefs, in practicing asking good questions. So each assignment sort of builds on the last, and you're sort of feeling like you're walking towards something, preparing your heart for time with other people. You get a sense of the diversity that's going to be in the room. You get a chance to express your hopes and fears. You're invited to pray for somebody in the group that ups your anxiety level or rubs you the wrong way. We don't tell each other who those people are, but you're invited to do that. So there's a whole series of things like that. And part of that process is, I think it's towards the end, we do talk about privilege. And that's always a tricky topic, right? Often the people with the most privilege are the most offended by the idea that there is privilege out there. But I do want people to understand that the queer identifying folks are taking the bigger risk in coming into this setting, because we're talking about their bodies, their lives, their relationships, right? This is not theoretical for them at all. And it's not theoretical for some of the straight people who are parents of queer kids or, loved ones of queer people, but it's just different. So I do take the time to talk about that. That can be a rough moment for some people, for various reasons. But I have found that it is worth the risk because I want people to be sensitized, and because I do want to protect the queer folks in the room. Even though I take great care and have great compassion for everybody in the room. Terry, I've actually come to see that great privilege is a great handicap. It keeps us from seeing others in a way, in many ways, but we are, I don't know. I probably don't have time to unpack that all here, but it can separate us from other people's experiences in a way. So unexamined privilege is absolutely debilitating. So my hope is to sensitize people at least a little bit. And some people really react to that idea of privilege. But of course, we all have privilege, and it shifts depending on where we are, depending on the context. So helping people understand that can diffuse that a little bit. But did that answer your question, Terry?
It does, yeah. And the fact you do a little bit of it ahead of time, like you say, that's a big part of your success, you said. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question.
Hey, Ben, I had a question, if that's okay. Chris, actually, Terry kind of inspired this. So Oriented Love is definitely obviously geared more towards, LGBTQ inclusion and understanding across divides. Have you thought of putting this model into place with race conversation, with political affiliation conversations, with any other range of divides that we see in the United States right now? Because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, we need you desperately. We need like a national model of this right now. Would be amazing. But I'm just curious, is there any plans to expand in some way?
Well, I personally feel very called to the sexuality and gender conversation. I'm not sure. I think it's because our sexuality and gender are so core to who we are, and our spirituality is so core to who we are. And there's a real interlinking of all of those things. So it's a super sweet spot for me in terms of the vulnerability that it involves, and just the coreness of who we are that it involves. However, I do think that the model can work for lots of different kinds of things. And we do facilitator training weekends for people that have been through Oriented to Love already. We train anybody who wants to come back and do the training. And then what they do with that is up to them. And it is fascinating. We did one 2 weekends ago, and at the end, we talk about how the context that they're going back to and how they're going to use them in their respective contexts. And that is so encouraging. So somebody's going to go back and use it around abortion roundtables and their abortion conversation roundtables in their church. Somebody's going to use it because their community is producing a musical around the 25th anniversary of Matthew Shepard's murder. And he wants ways to connect with the community, to help the community itself have conversation around that. Somebody else is going to use it in their family. Somebody else is going to use it. It was such a rich variety. Oh, back on campus, because she works at this institute for humility, intellectual humility. So all the applications are up to those people. And we have had people that are in DC and are interested in political conversations. I had this sort of secret wish for a while that I could get people on both sides of the aisle in Congress. It would have to be totally secret. You know, I hear that they have AA meetings that are secret on the Hill. And I just thought, well, if you can do an AA meeting secretly, why couldn't we have this sort of underground dialogue where we're just building friendships across the aisle? And I just think that would make such a big difference. And apparently there used to be more friendships across the aisle, but it's less and less common now. So, you know, we're always thinking, and if anybody ever really wanted to talk about, I mean, I'd be happy to advise or brainstorm with anybody, but right now we're a small organization, and this is my sweet spot. I don't feel called into other areas, but yeah, gun control. I mean, there's so many things we could have conversations about using this model.
I will pray that you can get a group in on Capitol Hill. That would be wonderful. Yeah, absolutely.
Never know. We have somebody in DC who's very, very keen on this idea. So we'll see.
Okay, friends, I'm going to stop our recording and live sharing there. Give me one moment.